Welcome to the Radical Intimacies podcast series by Memefest. I'm Oliver Vodeb, a sociologist looking closely at design and communication, co-founder of Memefest, and editor and curator of the Radical Intimacies, Designing Non-Extractive Relationalities book. In this podcast, I will be in conversation with the authors who contributed to the book, many of whom I've known for years as collaborators and friends. The book was published in 2023 by independent academic publisher Intellect. The book explores resistance to capitalist domination through design, focusing on dialogue, power, land, interventions, and radical praxis. It presents the concept of radical intimacies, a relational way of designing that fosters closeness and decolonizes knowledge and the public sphere. In this series, we'll dive into these ideas, discussing and expanding them, and creating spaces for deep, meaningful exchange in the undercurrents. Let's see what happens. Hello. Welcome to our next Memefest podcast episode in the Radical Intimacy series. I'm very happy to announce that our next episode is a conversation with the amazing Alexandra Crosby and Ilaria Vanni, both based at the University of Technology in Sydney. And they have contributed a beautiful chapter to the book titled Seed Balls as Method. Both of them understand, at least to a significant degree, their work as permaculture design. But as you will hear in our conversation, this understanding goes much broader than only working on, let's say, a garden that is based on permaculture principles, but they're extending the logic of permaculture into the social, political, and cultural realm, which I think is very rich and very important. I've been highly interested in their work and in this particular chapter because they are introducing concepts that, although somehow related to what many of us would be interested, they introduce novel things like plant literacy, plant eligibility, campaign objects, and they do this through their own particular project in which the central object is the seed balls, which they have implemented connecting their own university with the community. And what is very interesting to their work is that they create a elaborate and nuanced framework. They theorize their own work in ways which creates project providing opportunities to connect with the environment and with other people, and they sparking a sense of community while doing this. To just give you a bit of an idea of their work, so Alexandra Crosby is doing research in more than human design, recombinant ecologies, and emergent forms of design activism. That would be, in my view, a emergent form, what we will be discussing today. And Ilaria Vanni, also based at the University of Technology Sydney, a researcher. She's a writer and educator and explores how people, practices, and environments interact in cities. Also, I want to mention that they both have founded and are working on the amazing project Mapping at Edges Research Studio. So I welcome you to today's episode and I wish you a nice time for the next hour or so. Well, it's nice to see you both, and thank you for taking the time.
It's lovely to see you too, Oliver.
Very nice, as always. Always a joy.
I've been thinking more about your project and our conversation that we have had, just a few days ago. And I felt excited also reading a few other books or looking into them that I felt were related to your work. One of the things that you mentioned last time was that, that a way of thinking about your project was somehow to escape the city grid. And I like that because, immediately I have associations to design, the city grid design, even graphic design. But I wonder what constitutes the grid for you, and what is this grid, this city grid? What constitutes this grid that you tried to escape with your project?
Might start with my with my understanding of what a grid can be in a city. And for me, the grid is not just the infrastructures that you find, but also it is a discursive system in a way. So the way in which the city represents itself, the way people represent and understand the city. And we work specifically in places that are happening. So areas of urban renewal and regeneration. This is the language that is used generally by local government. Developers may use another language, which is development. And the sort of grid that is enacted in these projects of urban renewal is where we work quite a lot of infrastructure, which is great because we need that. But it's also a certain imaginary of, almost like new beginnings, as if there was no past. And the greening of these new beginnings is part of the grid in a way. And it's generally top down. So what we are interested in is different ways of approaching this idea of greening the city. Who has the right to green the city is a good question. And how can we do it? So we are trying in a way to intervene, and more than interfering, we talk about interference rather than intervention, because we are in Australia and intervention has other connotations, as in interventions in the Northern Territory in relation to Aboriginal Australia. So we prefer to use other words. And we, in this way, we try to redirect how the city is perceived, but also to create new possibilities that are very much grassroots possibilities for people to take action in the greening.
Yeah.
And I think, just to add to that, I think when I think of the grid of a city or a grid in a graphic design sense, I think of straight lines and angles, right? And even when you're trying to work outside the grid, you've got this is the dynamic, right? You've got the grid that is the precedent. And that's the same in urban planning as it is in graphic design. And now we have kind of revision of grid making in cities. We have the green grid and we have the blue grid. And we've actually been doing quite a lot of work on water in cities.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting to rethink the grid in a sense, especially a city like Sydney, where we work, which is a very watery city, because one of the things that we've discovered going back to the archives of that city is that the grid has had to work around the waterways, and you can still see that in, for example, winding streets and where there should be a neat grid, so to speak, if it was top down. That grid has had to work around ecological systems like water. And I guess that's something that we think about a lot. And in our chapter, the project that we describe in our chapter around seed balls, again, we're not working with straight lines. We're working with the way that we imagine, that imaginary that Ilaria was talking about, the way the lines of flight, if you like, are very much not straight lines, or not the straight lines that you might take in a car or on public transport or in the infrastructure that is built into the city grid. So to give a really specific example, seeds are spread throughout the city by bats and birds.
Yeah.
So they follow all kinds of directions as those, and rats, all kinds of directions through the city as those creatures travel. So we sometimes think of seed balls and of redirecting the green grid and green infrastructure in the city along the lines of kind of almost imitating those creatures. So we're amplifying the plant's reproduction through seeds, but we're not following those grids that you might if you were doing top-down greening of the city.
Yeah.
Yes, and I might add, we are both permaculture designers in our own way. And one of the principles of permaculture is that you avoid, when you can, straight lines, because you need to make more edges possible, hence mapping edges. And edges are places where there is a lot of biodiversity, where ecosystems meet, and so on and so forth. So if you look at permaculture garden designs, what you see is a lot of curves and wavy structures and so on and so forth. So it's a different type to think about, the grid.
Yeah. Thanks so much, both. Ilaria, I was just also thinking, my next thought was edges, which you just brought in. To me, both about what you were talking, like, for example, what Alexandra, you said, that a grid has to somehow work around the existing nature, that's perhaps more powerful, and it's obviously a manifestation of power. And I know you're very much, and with your work, you're very much interested in these edges, which somehow, in my mind, constitute, the less visible, the less obvious, for whatever reason. And it is, as an edge is somehow a borderline, and where this power is manifesting, or different sets of power. So what makes you being both so interested in edges? Can we speak more about them?
Yeah, I think edges are fascinating from a biodiversity perspective. They're so generative, and they're where ecosystems thrive, and multiple species can coexist. Also, metaphorically, they're very powerful, because edges, lots of things happen at edges, but I'm going to go straight to the politics of, I guess, tension and things rubbing up against each other, and that kind of conflict, if you like, that can happen at edges, where we imagine different ideas rubbing up against each other. We very much draw, in that metaphorical sense of edges, we very much draw from Anna Singh's work on friction, where we imagine, friction being a generative process that happens at multiple scales, where ideas rub up against each other, where different actors in different issue contexts and different places actually have different kinds of agency. It may not exactly be as it seems, the political dynamic in a particular place. So I guess in some ways we're dealing with edge, or we're adopting edge from a permaculture and a environmental science starting point, but we're also bringing in these ideas from social science and anthropology that help us think about what happens politically at edges.
Yeah. And also it is what we do with different disciplines. We make edges. We make these ecotones where different disciplines kind of can coexist. And the good thing about edges is also to remember that they are sites of uneven power relations. So one is forever alive to power.
Yeah.
And they're not just because it's an edge doesn't mean it's good. They're not neutral. I mean, one of the things we've thought about edges for a long time together and in various contexts. And I think one of the most powerful examples of an edge in this urban context and the idea of the urban grid is to do with mangroves. And again, to come back to some of our watery research, mangroves are a very typical edge. So they're sort of bracken, often thriving between fresh and salt water, and that they've kind of been touted as, you know, nurseries for tiny fish and et cetera, and they're fascinating. They're also highly problematic. They've been used, mangroves have been used by urban developers as there are first species to thrive when a waterway has been disturbed. So it's sort of like, again, reading edges as you see them and as you know them, but then also against the grain and through the archives is really important. I think mangroves have been interesting for us to think through along urban waterways.
And from a very, pragmatic point of view, we both work a lot and we do look at edges. Materially, we do look at edges a lot. And we started to notice that if you do that and if you really cultivate attention, you learn quite a lot from the city. You learn not just about the ecologies, but you also learn about the social life and the cultural influences of a certain place. So there is also this very practical aspect of edges.
Yeah, I like that, what you're saying, this connection between the plant world, the social, the cultural world, the political. On one hand, we have this, this idea of reading the edges, of reading nature, of reading plants, while at the same time, it seems to me you're both thinking about, the social. And, when we read research about plants in the plant world, the way plants are organized and the way they relate to each other, it seems, in terms of decentralization, coexistence and many other things, it seems like as if there's lessons, we can learn. And, a lot of people working in these areas have been making an argument for that. There are lessons that we can learn from the plant world. You said, Ilaria, before that you're both permaculture designers. And the way I understood this wasn't just you making gardens, right? Which is great in itself, but I understood it in this larger, broader way of thinking, namely plant world and the social, cultural, political, and so on. Can we talk about this a little bit more? I'm very intrigued, like permaculture designer, how does this relate to the social, cultural, political, even outside this particular project?
Yeah, so this project and our work in general started quite a long time ago. I mean, we have known each other since 2006 or something like that, I think. But we decided around 2016 to start working together as Mapping Edges. And we didn't have any funding, we didn't have any institutional support. It was an entirely tactical, we were talking earlier, it was an entirely tactical project. And the first thing that we did have support from Frontier Project, which is not only an artist-run space in Merrickville, and one of their initiatives is to give people a room for 2 weeks to develop a project. And we had this residency. This is how we started. And we wrote for about 3-4 days what our intentions were following permaculture design principles. But we were translating these principles into our research and into our lives. It was not just apply permaculture design to plants. So for so that's where mapping edges as such started. And to give you an example, at one point, we were asking ourselves, how can we integrate rather than segregate the different aspects of our work? And how do we integrate rather than segregate our interest in social and environmental justice with the lived reality of working in a university and having to do a certain type of research and so on and so forth. So it was a translations of these principles, and it looked to me very daunting at the beginning, because I couldn't see for the life of me how I could integrate what I had to do in my teaching with the research. And it took me about 2 years to work that one out.
Yeah, I think one of just to come back to the themes of the book, I think it's interesting reflecting on permaculture principles and the role of those principles in the development of our politics around plants and the way that we research plants, because I think from the beginning, the principles introduced an intimacy, if I can put it that way. Because if you look at permaculture principles, they're about, and just to say, we certainly have our own critiques of permaculture, and we're not sort of like, part of a cult or anything. I want to say that up front. But the principles are around closeness and intimacy. So observe and interact, small and slow solutions, integrate, don't segregate. These are ideas that are about closeness. So they're about scale, because stated your intention might be in permaculture terms to obtain a yield and grow food as you can, or they might be to survive an institution that doesn't give you space to practice the politics that you need to, right? And focusing on those principles already requires a kind of intimacy, I think, with your subject matter, but I guess also with each other around honesty of those intentions and everydayness of those principles put into practice. So it's not a kind of set and forget. And I think that's part of what you mean by a tactical intervention. It's about what you can do on a daily basis. And some of that is in your immediate surroundings of, that wasn't necessarily of your choosing. It might be your neighborhood that you live in, but it might be the department you ended up in at work, or so, and that requires, again, crossing and creating edges all the time.
The Seedball project is, to me, exactly this in many ways. Creating these objects that are not super difficult to create, and people can make them and use them in their everyday lives. But your project tries to develop, broader knowledge, give those seed balls more potential, more power, more possibilities than they, in most of the cases that I know have. And then there's this concept of literacy. And something that's very, very dear to me, very close to how I think, largely I was thinking about media literacy, but, you're enhancing this. And I remember when we were talking last time, we had this discussion, Ilaria and I, we were talking about Europe and politics, and then, we got a bit fired up as we do. And then Alexandra said, yes, great. However, you said there is something specific about Australia, which is, a different type of literacy that you feel is emerging here, largely related to what you mentioned, a fairly extreme, ecological or natural environment with, natural disasters, fires, floods, and so on. I'm very intrigued about this. I was thinking a lot about this, like Alexandra, what you said, that there is something that is specific here. Can you tell us again, please, about this?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it as well. And, I think literacy is place-based, and there are different types of literacy and different ways of reading places that are really specific to the socio-ecological circumstances of that place. I guess there's two parts to, perhaps we'll keep it to cities, to Australian cities. And one is that they're on country. So this is a literacy issue, I think, that has been way too slow to develop. If we think of it as literacy, people in cities don't necessarily recognize the urban environment as country, and therefore don't recognize the care that goes into and is required to take place in those cities. And that's one aspect. I think things are improving as we slowly listen to Aboriginal leaders in this space. But the other part that I was talking about was around climate change and the sensory aspect of climate change. I mean, in our city of Sydney, in our adult lives, we have experienced, fire, flood, and drought multiple times. And I think, I'm not saying that doesn't happen in other parts of the world, but I think that processing those events requires a kind of literacy, and furthermore, processing them in a way that connects them to the way that those events that connects them to the way that we live, and that the way that we read and understand and care for nature in urban contexts is really complicated and is really site specific, and I'm not sure happens in the same way in European cities perhaps as it does in Australia. I'm not sure, but I feel it's more and more place specific the more and more we go down the impact of climate change.
Yes, and just before we started, we were talking exactly about this, because I think that I was not really clear on what I meant when I was talking about political literacies last time. And I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realized that that what we are doing is to create, I hope, an ecological compass for people. So all our events, all the objects we make function as a wayfinder. It is and I like the idea of compass because it is place related. So sometimes we talk about orientation devices, but that's the idea, that it is a way for people to orient themselves in their local ecologies. So we are not really teaching anything about ecology as such, because we are not ecologists, but we are creating resources, if you want, so that people can connect and understand their ecologies and the symbols where.
And I think, to go back to media literacy, is kind of interesting, because it reminds me that we often have this challenge in our work where people might say, oh, that's a great idea, how would you scale it up? Right? We hear this as researchers all the time. Designers hear this all the time. How would you scale it up? How would you apply it to different contexts or places? So I think thinking about what we do as a compass and some of the aspects of mapping edges, even the Seedball project, it's the design of tools and ways to design tools and events. It's not necessarily about those designs. So the idea of media literacy being about universal meaning, for example, or memes being able to speak across cultures and ecologies and societies, in the same way in different places. I think that's one of the things we grapple with, and it's not what it might look from the outside like these are very small scale kind of designs. But the emphasis is on how to design that thing for that place. rather than designing the same thing for every place.
Of course, yeah. I think even, you know, within the discipline of design, although there is progress, but like it's difficult to articulate what exactly is this design because it quickly becomes intangible, you know, and there's all this, you know, like terms, you know, ontological design, which I like, you know, service design, which I like a bit less, but like, you know, this attempts to articulate the invisible, which is the design in the end, or the effect of designing, you know, designing is world making. And this, I think, is a difficulty, even for the disciplines of design or for the knowledge creation. You know, when we do a project, what's the tangible thing? How can we think about, you know, all these things? And I guess you are developing a vocabulary, maps you are developing, well, a compass I like, the ecological compass, you know, to orient ourselves. Somehow it seems a very difficult and large task, isn't it? You know, on one hand, and I agree with you, Ali, that you know, literacy is embedded, is place-based, and one would think that what, you know, the happenings in Australia, you know, the manifestations of nature would teach us a lesson. But it seems hard to learn this lesson still. You know, if you look at how people behave, what cars are being sold, you know, which cars are the most sold cars, you know, all kinds of different behaviors. And to me, the difficulty is to take our, you know, efforts to a point where there would be a connection between the symbolic and the structural. You know, on the symbolic realm, it seems like there is progress, and people can talk about it. But in terms of actions, then it seems like we are still very much in a place of highly individualized, you know, subjects, be it through neoliberalization or you know, technocratic systems. So, you know, like how to, you know, again an edge, you know, in between those two levels of thinking or enacting. So I don't have, of course, an answer. It seems like, you know, what needs to be done is exactly what you're doing, or what, you know, what we're all trying to do, some of us, you know, to keep on digging in and keep on working on it, you know, and keep on developing it. Because as to me personally, as the moment I think, you know, we've achieved something, or you know, I got an insight, or a project really, you know, did something, you know, it seems like that another dimension of the problem opens, you know, which I didn't know it's there, you know. So it's kind of really massive, the challenge that we are facing. So, you know, it's not really a question, but, you know, I just wanted to say that I still feel frustrated between those, you know, those levels of symbolism and you know, actual structural change. You know, perhaps it's time to speak about capital again, Ilaria.
It's always fun to speak about capital, isn't it? Yes, thank you for this, Oliver, because while you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, your stress on relationality and on creating relations that are non-extractive.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, is also related to capital. But for us, one of the, you know, one of the real problems is that this kind of work with the seed balls can be co-opted by any, you know, any capitalist venture, really.
Yeah.
It's very easy because they're cute. They greenwash very well.
They're very Instagrammable.
They're totally
Yeah. Yeah.
Instagrammable.
Yeah.
So one of the things to always ask is, how do we escape that? And can we escape that? Nobody can escape capital. There is no outside. We know this. We are all inside. But how do we create frictions? And
Yeah.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Creating frictions, and in that way, also generating moments of resistance. So hopefully the type of relations that we create, and it's, among each other, but also with people who come to our projects, and with plants and the city, and the modern humans in the city are non-extractive because do not produce anything in a way. They produce relations.
Yeah.
And they produce connections. But to use European, if you want, language, these relations cannot be put to work.
Mm.
So that's, I guess, where there is this friction with capitalist ventures. So we don't do anything that we don't charge ever to come to our walks, to our events. So Ali was saying,
Yeah.
yeah, we do have some really strong principles, which we don't even think about when we organize events and when we design objects, because they are so much ingrained, I guess, in how we think.
Yeah, that would feel on the verge of extractive to us to have a ticketed event where there was that transaction. It's so,
Yeah.
this is different for every project. I'm not like saying that no one should ever charge for designed events, but for us, it is, as Ilaria said, so much about those relationalities that it wouldn't really feel like it was the politics we intended. And I think just along those lines, the project that we describe in the book, in the chapter of the book, is the first time we had really explicitly done something like this on campus with students and staff on campus, and made a real effort to activate relational politics on campus through plants and through relationships. That is an experiment in itself. It's not something that that we have parts of our work plan carved out for, so for us, it's important research, and we did conduct a survey, and we, used all our ethnographic methods and did all the right things like good academics. But it's also a move in a workplace to do something, again, tactical, that is not about the things you're meant to be doing. And I think that there is a politics to that. Universities are not imagined as seed bally places.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's beautiful to me. And I want, let's talk directly about the project, So, the way I understand it is there's different complexities that you both have been talking about now. And, you're both academics. And the project did, outside of the culture of carving out a space in your workload model, whatever. However, like it happened on campus. So, to me, what's poetic about this kind of work is that we do, create, contradictory situations. So, we happen to be on campus. We use the resources, rightly so, since we work there. We are academics, but we use them in a particular way, and use them in a way where we also try to experience moments where we feel we're a bit outside of the performance treadmill, right? But on the other hand, we're doing actual work, and there's impact. So, like, if we can't just walk, a little bit through the project, which our listeners, will be able to read in the book. But there was three main parts. There was the library, there was the walks, and then there was the seed balls. and maybe, maybe if we can just talk a little bit about them through the lens of these contradictions, that we now, all three of us somehow, we started to talk about.
So maybe I'll start with the library. So the project was a Creatives in Residence project that the UTS library programs each year. So we're really lucky to have a university librarian and a team of library staff that really value these kinds of open-ended creative projects. So to say that, I acknowledge that not all university libraries are quite the same as ours, and ours is fabulous.
Yeah.
So it started with this project as Creatives in Residence at the library. Now, there's a really important aspect to the moment, the timing that it started, which is UTS was going through a significant campus redevelopment, which involved the library moving from its old place opposite Paddy's Markets. It had been there a very long time, was very well known as the UTS library, deep in Chinatown, to moving to a brand new architecturally award-winning building, which the university was very proud of. It's a very pretty building. And so this was a big move, right? It's also a time of great disruption, and we're often interested in working in moments of disruption because they're interesting politically. They throw up all these opportunities to talk about things that you wouldn't necessarily get to with business as usual, and people can be quite open to new ideas in those moments. So these two things were happening at the same time. We had this idea of turning the UTS library into a planty place while we were in residence. And also the library had this design challenge of moving the library physically. We weren't part of the truckloads of books that were being transported, but culturally moving the library from one place to another. So the university librarian said to us, people aren't going to know where the library is. So back to Ilaria's idea about designing compasses, this was a really pragmatic concern. Where is the library? So one of the key ideas that we came up with was, well, we could help guide people the most direct route from the old library to the new library, and you just stop at that traffic light, go down that street, turn left, and then you're there. Or we could gesture towards some planty paths and some less direct ways of traversing that land and thinking about being on country between those 2 points on the map. And that's what we decided to do. So that introduces what we did with the walk. So we set up an installation in the old library in the first phase of the project, where we drew a whole lot of different resources together from different disciplines on plants to try to create a planty bookshelf that people could enjoy. And we also transformed the space into a kind of indoor garden space, which was quite lush and lovely to hang out in and read about plants. And our hope with that was that, ecologists might sit down and look at botanical illustrations, or they might pick up a crazy book about I don't know.
There were some really beautiful books on macro photography of plants.
Oh, beautiful.
Looking at structures, for instance, much more architectural than anything else.
Yeah.
So talking about architecture, I just want to make another point. This installation was at the entrance of the library, of the old library, which was this absolutely cavernous space where nothing ever happened. Like, it was just a place people went through as quickly as possible because it was dark, concrete.
If you can imagine that smooth 1970s concrete and that grey/lavender carpet on the ground, and do not notice these things as you walk through. Get to your bookshelf as quickly as possible.
So instead, we created an interruption there, and we put in some very comfortable armchairs and these plants that were so lovely, and grow lights because there was not enough light. And people did stop there, and they could borrow the books that we had placed on this bookshelf, and we had to keep on putting in new books because people just borrowed
They were borrowing them,
which was great.
And the librarians also helped us make a digital bookshelf so that we could see what was being borrowed, and so that resource books were actually brought out of their home into this new edge, this new cataloging edge, which was a really fun, nerdy librarian aspect of the project.
Yeah. So,
and then we designed, a series of walks, which then generated our map and a artist book. And then the last thing we did is so there was sort of three stages: the planty bookshelf, the series of walks with the accompanying maps and artist book, and then thirdly this hilarious workshop to make seed balls in this brand new library that had never been used and had not had the protective surfaces peeled off the lighting switches yet. And we marched up there with buckets of soil and compost and threw it around this brand new space that still smelt like corporate architecture. So that was maybe a highlight of my university career. I hope it's not the last time I get to throw mud around, honestly.
Yeah, it was pretty extraordinary. And our librarian was there, and he was having a ball, making balls, and it was quite it was quite hilarious in many ways, because yes, there was soil, compost, and there was a bit of manure because you need that in seed balls. So the smell changed very rapidly.
Did you have to fill out some occupational health and safety forms for doing that?
I think we may have got away with the time of disrupt. I don't know. Did we?
I think we did, and we did have a safety, like we all had gloves and masks.
Of course. Even masks. Wow.
Yes, because it is quite dangerous to work with soil without wearing a mask. So everybody had to wear one. And yes, and those latex gloves that you need to use. So we did consider that, and when we walk, we have a risk protocol, which we communicate to everyone. It is quite long, and it is entirely pragmatic, but there are things that you don't think about sometimes, like my favorite bit is do not pet dogs you do not know.
Which I never abide by, do I? I get in trouble.
I do ask for permission.
So, okay, I'm interested when you did the walks. Was there any kind of, historical philosophers, authors that, we probably all like, that you had in mind? Or was it like just more improvisational and you just let people around the campus where you thought it's interesting to walk?
A very interesting question, because I don't know, I've read tons of cultural histories of walking. But they're not very present when I walk.
Well,
I think that what influences me mostly is Anna Tsing and thinking about, arts of noticing. So really dedicating your full attention to where you are.
So cultivating a way of walking, observing, being in space. I guess that's part of the literacy that you're teaching or developing, right?
Attentiveness.
Attentiveness, right.
So it is very easy to think of this kind of projects as a derive, but it's not really. Because we are guided by ecologies and plants. So it's not as if, it is not a situation This type of
Mhm.
walk.
I mean, also, I think just so when we designed the walks, we were thinking about redirection and redirective practice, and we were thinking about ways that people might walk most efficiently to the library, and then how we could redirect those paths. So I'm just saying that because we work, UTS is located in this kind of precinct in Ultimo, and it involves our campus, which is spread out a little bit like RMIT, Oliver, a number of buildings in different places for those in the audience that haven't been there, a very urban campus. And we're also right next to this goods line, which is a historic piece of infrastructure that you can walk along. You know, think the New York High Line, but very small. And short. But that's the idea, that idea of bringing ecologies back to walking spaces in the city. And then we're also at the Powerhouse Museum, which has a very specific history to the area, and the ABC. And then also next to the new library, where the new library is Ultimo TAFE. So one of the things we were thinking about is we were walking with, you know, our invitation was open to the broader public, but because of our networks, we walked with mostly UTS students and staff. And so thinking about campus beyond what is branded and what is what the wayfinding set is UTS. So for that reason, we walked through TAFE, which is a totally separate institution, which we do have many relationships with. But what we noticed was completely different landscaping, completely different design of that building, completely different history to those buildings of that part of the campus. So, you know, we saw there a whole lot more freedom around staff and students creating their own green spaces at TAFE than you would see at a university, which is kind of interesting. Why? You know, areas that just had these beautiful succulent gardens that were obviously tended to by the people that worked there, not outsourced to a corporate gardening company. So those kind of differences that you can only sort of attune to if you're stepping outside, I guess, your own institutional boundaries, or what you understand to be a campus, and stretch it to a precinct, and then challenge the precinct and think of it as an ecology, right? So step by step.
The word outsourced again triggers me a little bit. And I think, you know, like perhaps that's something that we need to include in literacy sessions, you know, for people to say, aha, what does that mean? I mean, people hear it all the time, but what does it mean? It's really, you know, the opposite to the ecological, right? It's not, it's, you know, it kind of is being pushed in between rather than creating relations, right? You know, it dissolves relations, it dissolves history, it dissolves attachment, it dissolves care, and it definitely comes, you know, with a set of rationalities that are, you know, they would be productivist, extractive, technocratic, and we see this outsourcing everywhere. You know, it blew my mind when you said the other time that certain organizations they would have plants outsourced, you know, and then everything's organized. People come and water them, you know, but they belong. They kind of exist on a spreadsheet somehow, you know, somewhere.
Definitely on the spreadsheet.
Yes,
You know?
probably your institution outsources plants.
Probably this is what I mean, you know, when I said that some type of institutions would do that, you know, probably both of our institutions do that, and many others, you know. I came to realize this when we had this conversation last time, and that's fascinating.
So if you wonder why, you know, the plants in the corridor you traverse to go to work are always green, is because they are on rotation. They are not the same plants. You're not seeing the same plant. They've been rotated. Yes.
So they're being kind of updated. A new plant is being put in a position so it constantly looks nice.
Yes, but I want to mention something here,
Mm.
again connected to the library, because this is the counters to this outsourcing. So
Yeah,
the new library has two uh, very big balconies with gardens.
yeah,
And one of the gardens, the librarian has put this, well, not him personally, but anyway, he has organized for this row of fig trees,
yeah,
and these fig trees are rescued.
yeah,
So this is the opposite of the outsourcing. This is fig trees that are there to stay and they've been rescued.
yeah, yeah. Well, which is nice. So at least it does exist. Um, Seed Balls has radical intimacy. You know, I would like us to delve into that part of your chapter. Um, so there's several concepts that you know you're introducing and you're using. One is the notion of impression. The other is campaigning artifacts. When I was reading, you know, I read now the chapter several times, quite a few times actually, in over a time period. And you know, this idea of how you think about making seed balls in a very complex manner that has this impressions on people that are participating. Uh, you know, I said to you that it has on one, you know, at one time it has reminded me of how I felt when we started to do culture jamming in Slovenia, you know, at night and uh, spraying on billboards and climbing them and you know and so on. And it's a beautiful act. It's a you know it's an act that changes you. And I thought of this in a similar way when I was doing night poster campaigns with students in Brisbane. And after that, I realized that in Brisbane, postering is kind of illegal, you know? You know, I could see how students were changed because of that. So, um, can you, you know, can you please tell us about, you know, campaigning artifacts, how you thought of them as seed balls, and then how this all goes into the idea of impression and impressions of you know how theorized by Sarah Ahmed, and then radical intimacies.
You want to go campaigning now?
Okay. So campaigning artifacts is a concept that Guy Julia developed around design activism and the potential politics of design. And we've used it a few times to think with, because we find it quite powerful, especially when we're talking about a repertoire of objects, of designed objects or artifacts or things, and how they work in the world. So it's not just about making these things together. It's not just about the participation that is part of the process of designing, but it's about what these objects actually do in the world. So they travel and they have paths and they do politics along the way, and they mobilize particular publics around them, not just in that time of designing and the materials that are incorporated as we design, but also depending on where they go. So it can be quite a powerful way to think about something like a little seed ball, because a seed ball is designed to travel in the world and then to it itself transforms, and as it transforms and germinates, in the case of a seed ball, the hope is that it transforms
Yeah,
other people. So it's sort of a way of thinking about little things producing big politics.
yeah,
Yes, and in terms of the impression side of things, so we really have you to thank you about this part, because this is a reflection um, about the workshop and what happened in the workshop and in the walks. And this reflection was really, you know, enabled by you and your um, invitation to write for Radical Intimacies, because so I will just describe these actions. And
Yeah.
Saleh Ahmed talks about impressions in terms of the cognitive, but also the the perception and the emotions that are linked to impressions. So when you make seed balls, it's a very embodied act, a bit
Yeah.
like climbing up a billboard or
Yeah.
going doing something that involves your whole body, but also your perception of, I don't know, the space, others, and so on and so forth, and your brain, your cognitive functions too. But it is also very tactile. So you have to mix things, you have to mold things, you have to make these little balls with your hands. And we did this in a group, so and small groups within the big group. So people talked, exchanged impressions of what they were doing, but also they impressed their their hands on the seed balls, and
Yeah.
the seed balls impressed themselves on their hands and on their emotions. So emotion here is key. We didn't know that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
So it was really, this was really emerging in the workshop. People became very attached to their seed balls. And
Yeah.
different groups produced different kind of seed balls, a bit because they were using different mixes, different seeds and so on, but they were quite recognizable in a way. So these seed balls, once they were done, we left them in the library to dry. And then after a week or so, we did a walk where we
Yeah.
scattered seed balls.
Yeah.
And people were super attached to their seed balls. Like they were cradling them in their hands,
Yeah.
and they were placing them. Some people talked a bit to them while they put them
Photographing them.
photographing them. So it was and it was very intimate.
Yeah.
There was a lot of intimacy between, the gesture of relating to this seed bowl that had
Yeah.
seeds, and then it went into the environment. So it created a very intimate relationship with the environment as well.
Yeah.
So, oh well, people were quite happy. They, it created relations between staff, students, and so on and so forth. We had tons of photos of the people smiling. So happy event. So after a month, we went for a last walk to see what had germinated, and it was very hot. It hadn't rained for, months probably at that point. And there were bushfires. So there was this smoke hanging over the city, and it was quite, the bushfire smell that you get in Australia. It was hot. And the smoke was such that it was not even that sunny.
Yeah.
Bit glary, but not sunny. And so we were walking and we realized very soon that nothing had germinated. Maybe one seed ball. We are not
Yeah.
sure. It
There
might
was
have
a bit
been,
of parsley growing that could
yeah,
have been ours.
it could have been a
Yeah.
seed ball, but we don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And people, the mood became very, very gloomy very soon,
Yeah.
and very depressive because their little seed balls that they had cared for so much and made with such attention, um, basically were dead.
Yeah.
So, at first we thought of this as failure, but then again, during this walk, we realized talking with people and then, very quickly writing notes about the work itself, that what had happened is that a new type of understanding of climate change
Yeah.
emerged during this work, and it was an intimate type of understanding. People lived it because it hadn't rained, it was hot, there were bushfires, their little seed balls had not germinated.
It's kind of like this attachment that developed to an ecological system and to the weather and to climate through this small object, which we'll call a campaigning artifact, that people had been involved in designing. And it was quite a moving thing to witness.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense to me. And I think what you both now have explained, I think really is, well, I understand it as such as this process of intensification, of this campaign object. It was in everything that you both have explained that this became so important for the people through all these processes, and the symbolism of seeds and touching and hands and all of this. This is how the intensification has happened. To me, that's highly interesting. How to think about campaign objects and intensification. How can we create a process of intensification? Because I guess that is what in the end has an effect on people, or a impression.
Yeah, I think for me, it also has a lot to do with having the patience for durational design in a way. I mean, we could have done the workshop, the seed balling workshop, and then finished the project and everyone takes home their seed balls, or and fine. But I think having the patience, or I don't know if patience is the right word, but seeing a design process as part of a bigger design process, always. Campaigning artifact can help you do that, but also a workshop is never just a workshop. A public that's gathered around a particular event is never just that, but you have to make space for that kind of iteration and reflection to happen. And of course, everything comes back to climate breakdown if we're talking about designing anything around ecologies. And in a way, it's really fortunate that that happened so that we could understand that it happened, even though it is very sad that those seeds did not germinate in our campus precinct.
But who knows, maybe participants, or some of them, are making their own seed balls.
Exactly, Oliver, exactly.
Yes, some of them took some seed balls home and planted them, and those because they were watering them. So yeah.
So that's beautiful. One of the things that you mentioned is plants seem to be somehow positioned lower in the hierarchy. It's humans, and then there's animals, and then there's plants. Why is that?
Cultural legacy, I guess. But I think it is changing, or that is my perception, which probably is entirely biased, because plants don't move.
Unless you throw them in a seed ball.
Yeah.
But I think it's also because we don't have this, culturally, this integrated understanding of relationality in that sense. So we create hierarchies conceptually when they don't really exist. I think this is to come back to why we need to understand cities as being on country, because concepts of country do that differently to that simple hierarchy: people, animals, and then plants that you're talking about. So I think that's really I think it's really important. But we're not of the school that thinks, necessarily that's super interested in like the sentience of plants or things like that.
No.
We talk to plants, I'll confess, we do talk to plants, but not in a way that we think that they're talking back. Or in a planty crazy lady way.
Yeah, we are not scientists. So I've read there is a really interesting Italian neurobiologist who does plant neurobiology called Stefano Mancuso. He's translated in English. His book is called Brilliant. Yeah, there you go.
So that's, a book I read a while ago, The Nation of Plants. You know this one?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's but that's we don't do that kind of research.
Yeah.
And when I read, I'm fine reading the books, but when I try to read the actual scientific articles, I get lost because it's it is a different language altogether. There is a limit to transdisciplinarity there.
But I guess the idea of plantiness, and as designers and design researchers, creating worlds that include plants in our thinking is really important.
Yeah, I love from the start when you said we two are permaculture designers, and I knew what you mean with that. It's not just making gardens. If I look at our curriculum in the master's program where I teach, there's definitely a lack of projects. There's a lot of projects that aren't strictly commercial, and they're somehow engaged with the world in a different way, but projects that deal explicitly with nature and with plants, they're missing. And I think that would be something that we could observe in general if we would look at most of the programs. And I think I have shown the maps that I'm always happy to receive in my mail, to my students, that we've been working on a project about the Yarra River. So, I can only say how helpful and beautiful the work that you're doing is. So perhaps my last question in the formal time. So where are you going with this? Where are you going with your work on this?
The river.
Now you're in the river. Now you're doing work with the river.
We're wetlands, but the river. So the river is there. Some wetlands are underground, but that's so we are extending to water.
And plants literally guided us there.
Yeah.
I mean, once you start attuning to plants in the city, then you need to be attuned to water as well, because except for those outsourced corporate plants that we're talking about, plants respond to light and water primarily. So
they led you to the river.
Yeah, they did. Well, and to the hidden wetlands of the river, the catchment of the river. The most obvious example, I think, in the Sydney Basin where we work is recognizing wetland trees. So things like mangroves I mentioned before, but paperbarks, trees who once you understand them to thrive on water, it's not that deep underground, and then you can literally see the water when you see the plants, even though you can't see the water, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
that's where the plants have led us to think about what is invisible, what is less visible, and in the places we've been working, and back to this question about the grid, it's the water that is undergrounded and forced into invisibility in the project of city making. And that is true of many cities. It's very, very, very true of Sydney. It's a very watery city, and people think of the Sydney Harbour and it's glittery, the beautiful, picturesque harbour, but all of the city is watery.
Yeah. So I started to think about this as the way Sydney is imagining this through saltwater borders, but there is actually a lot of freshwater wetlands, and that's how the city developed, following literally these wetlands in colonial times. So yes, that's a direction.
And helping understand the history of that burying and undergrounding of natural water systems, wetlands primarily, I think we believe will help us contribute to better futures, as again in the context of climate change. I mean, water is very high risk, as we know. It's highly managed. It's very its relationship to the built environment in cities like Sydney is very problematic. And so, yeah, this is part of both thinking historically and being future facing around what we design. And
so we do think, first of all, that this is another, hopefully, way to build more relations between people and the urban wetlands. And with people, I don't mean just residents. Of course, we are thinking about the residents who live in places that are or were wetlands, but also engineers. Yes, so it is really important for civic and water engineers to understand that a landscape where they might be, installing a new stormwater drain was once a wetland because it behaves differently, and ecologists and landscape architects and so on and so forth. So, and developers, why not? If they are interested in listening, they are part of our audience as well. And it is important for developers as well, because if they start developing a high-rise building on a wetland that requires a certain type of building, and I know this because where I live was a wetland, and I can see the developments going up and sort of problems that arise from that.
Yes. You're gonna do some workshops with that as well, and inviting all these different people, engineers and everyone, and then trying to create some sort of translation between all these people. Who knows? But that maybe is something that needs to be done. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah.
We have done a walk. There were no engineers in the walk, but there were scientists and artists.
Right.
And
some of the researchers on our team have been doing quite a lot of canoeing and kayaking on the river, which is another way to engage with very different in very different conversations, because it's such a different point of view to see the wetland from the wetlands from the water, and I think also attracts kind of different kinds of people from workshops. So watch this space. We're also likely to produce quite a few more campaigning artifacts. We don't know what those will look like yet, but we're working with both material artifacts but also a digital knowledge platform that will visualize wetlands. So yeah, we'll see what we come up with.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is a production of Memefest and Intellect, publisher of Original Thinking. It is a celebration of our collaboration and Intellect's 40th anniversary. The podcast is produced in Naarm, also known by its colonial name Melbourne. We would like to pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. The music at the start and end of each episode is by the band Bait from Boona in Victoria, with members Michael McGuinness and Malachi Doral. You can find them on Bandcamp. Check them out. Thanks. Until our next episode, take care.